I stood up at the family dinner table with my heart pounding, my phone still warm in my hand from refreshing the results one last time. I had practiced this moment all day. I passed the exam, I said, my voice trembling just enough to give me away. For one brief second, everything was silent. Then Daniel's mother, Margaret, leaned back in her chair, folded her arms, and smiled the way people do right before they cut you down. "Oh," she said lightly. "Did they lower the standards this year?" Laughter rippled around the table. Glasses clinked. Someone muttered a joke under their breath. I waited for Daniel to look at me, to say something, to remind them this mattered. He didn't. He just kept eating, staring at his plate like my achievement wasn't worth acknowledging. In that moment, I realized this wasn't about an exam at all. It was about power, and how quickly people will try to take it away the second you dare to feel proud of yourself. I had imagined that dinner going very differently. Daniel's parents' house was warm and familiar, the kind of place that smelled like roasted chicken and expensive candles. The table was set perfectly, white plates aligned with military precision, crystal glasses catching the light. This was one of those family dinners, the kind where appearances mattered more than honesty. Margaret sat at the head of the table, elegant as always, her pearls resting neatly against her collarbone. Robert poured the wine, already halfway through a story about someone important he'd met at his country club. Jason lounged back in his chair, scrolling on his phone, pretending not to care. Everyone looked comfortable, confident, in control. I wasn't. All through the meal, my phone burned against my thigh, the notifications still there, unchanged. Passed. I replayed the word in my head like a secret song. I had earned this. Years of studying, late nights, self-doubt. I had made it through. When there was a pause in the conversation, I finally stood up. "I have something to share," I said. They all looked at me. Margaret's smile tightened, polite but thin. Daniel glanced up, surprised. "I passed the exam," I continued. "I'm officially certified." That was when Margaret smirked and asked her question. And that was when I realized this family had already decided who I was long before I ever opened my mouth. For a moment after Margaret spoke, I told myself I was imagining the tension. Surely she hadn't meant it that way. Surely I was just being sensitive. That's what I'd been trained to think whenever her words left a sting behind them. "You're overreacting, Emily. She's just joking." But then Jason laughed. Not a polite chuckle, not an awkward cough. A real laugh. "Well, that explains it," he said, finally looking up from his phone. "I was wondering how you pulled it off." Margaret dabbed at the corner of her mouth with her napkin, still smiling. "I mean, exams aren't what they used to be. They're trying to be more inclusive now." Inclusive. The word landed like an accusation. Robert leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine. "What school did you say you went to again?" he asked casually. "It wasn't Ivy League, right?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. Daniel knew the answer. He had driven me to campus dozens of times. He had listened to me cry over practice questions, watched me fall asleep on my notes. I waited for him to speak. He didn't. Margaret tilted her head, studying me like a problem that didn't quite add up. "It's just surprising," she said softly. "People sometimes exaggerate their achievements." The table went quiet again, but this time it wasn't anticipation. It was judgment. And for the first time that night, I felt something colder than embarrassment creeping up my spine. The slow realization that they didn't want to celebrate me at all. They wanted me small. I could have handled Margaret's smirk. I could have brushed off Jason's sarcasm and Robert's thinly veiled doubt. What I wasn't prepared for was Daniel's silence. I turned toward him, searching his face for anything, confusion, irritation, even discomfort. Instead, he stared down at his plate, slowly cutting his food like this was just another ordinary dinner. Like nothing important had just happened. "They sent the results directly," I said, trying to steady my voice. "It wasn't easy. I studied for years." Daniel finally looked up. "Well," he said carefully, "those exams do have different formats now, right? Multiple sections, different grading systems." My chest tightened. "That doesn't make them easier," I replied. "You know that." He shrugged. "I'm just saying sometimes people misunderstand how the scoring works." Margaret's eyes flickered with approval. Jason smirked again. "So you might have read it wrong?" Margaret asked sweetly. "It happens." I felt the room closing in, every face turned toward me, waiting for me to doubt myself out loud, waiting for me to apologize for being proud. "I didn't read it wrong," I said quietly. "I passed." Daniel sighed the way people do when they think you're being difficult. "Emily, no one's attacking you. We're just being realistic." That word, realistic, hit harder than any insult. Because in that moment, I understood something with painful clarity. The man I loved would rather keep the peace with his family than stand up for me. And that realization hurt more than all their laughter combined. Margaret set her fork down slowly, the sound sharp against the plate. The conversation around the table faded, as if everyone sensed something heavier was coming. "Emily," she said, her tone suddenly calm, almost gentle, "you need to understand how this looks." I swallowed. "How it looks?" She folded her hands together. "When someone comes from a modest background, there can be a temptation to stretch the truth, especially when trying to impress a future family." The air felt tight in my lungs. "I'm not stretching anything," I said. "I earned this." Jason leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Come on. You really expect us to believe you outperformed people who've been preparing for this their entire lives?" "I've been preparing for this my entire life," I snapped before I could stop myself. Robert cleared his throat. "Let's all stay calm," he said, though his eyes never left me. "We just don't want misunderstandings. These kinds of claims can damage reputations if they aren't accurate." "Reputations. Not my feelings. Not my effort. Their reputation." Margaret nodded slowly. "Exactly. If this turns out not to be true, it would be very embarrassing. For all of us." Daniel shifted beside me, uncomfortable but still silent. He didn't deny it. He didn't defend me. That was when I felt something inside me harden. They weren't confused. They weren't joking. They were accusing me, politely, carefully, with smiles still on their faces, but accusing me all the same. And they were doing it with complete confidence that I wouldn't push back. They were wrong. And for the first time that night, I stopped trying to make them understand and started preparing to protect myself. Margaret stood up so abruptly that her chair scraped loudly against the floor. The sound made everyone flinch. "This conversation isn't finished," she said, stepping closer to me. "You don't get to make a claim like that and then walk away when people ask questions." "I'm not walking away," I replied, my voice steady despite the pounding in my ears. "I'm setting a boundary." She reached out and closed her hand around my wrist, not hard, but firm enough to stop me from moving. The room went completely still. "Sit down," she whispered. "We need to sort this out properly." Every instinct in me screamed to pull free, but I didn't raise my voice. I didn't panic. "Let go of me," I said calmly. "Now." Margaret scoffed. "Don't be dramatic." "I'm not," I answered. "But I am asking you to remove your hand. If you don't, this crosses into something you really don't want to explain later." Her smile faltered. Robert stood halfway up from his seat. "Emily, don't threaten my wife." "I'm not threatening anyone," I said, finally meeting his eyes. "I'm stating a legal boundary. I have the right to leave, and I have the right not to be restrained." Daniel stared at me like he didn't recognize the woman standing there. Margaret released my wrist, as if it suddenly burned her. "You think a piece of paper makes you untouchable?" "No," I said quietly. "I think knowing my rights makes me unmanageable." I picked at my coat. "This relationship is over," I said, turning to Daniel. "Not because of your family, but because you watched this happen and chose silence." No one laughed this time. And as I walked toward the door, I realized something powerful. They had just lost the control they were so sure they had over me. I didn't hear from Daniel for weeks after that night.
No apology. No explanation.
Just a few missed calls I never returned, and a long message I didn't have the energy to read. I threw myself into work instead, letting routine and focus do what emotions couldn't. I showed up early. I stayed late. I reminded myself, again and again, that walking away had been necessary, even if it still hurt. 2 months later, my phone rang during a lunch break. It was Ms. Thompson, my supervisor. "Emily," she said, businesslike but warm, "I need to ask you something before I assign a new case." She explained that a formal complaint had been filed against a small consulting firm for intimidation and misuse of influence. As she listed the names involved, my stomach tightened. Margaret Carter, Robert Carter. The complaint alleged that they had pressured a former employee into silence after threatening her professional future. Nothing violent. Nothing dramatic. Just the kind of quiet, calculated behavior that made people feel trapped. "I want to be clear," Ms. Thompson continued. "Do you have any personal connection to this family that could create a conflict of interest?" I took a breath. "I used to date their son. I no longer have contact with them." There was a pause. Then, "Thank you for being upfront," she said. That's exactly what I needed to hear. She assigned the case to another team, but asked me to assist with background research and documentation. Not because of my history, she emphasized, but because I was thorough and careful. As I reviewed the file later that afternoon, something settled inside me. I wasn't powerless anymore. I wasn't being judged at a dinner table. The same rules that Margaret once mocked now existed to protect people from exactly the kind of pressure she thought she could get away with. And for the first time since that night, I felt something close to calm. Not victory, but balance. Daniel finally reached out on a quiet Sunday evening. His name lit up my phone while I was making tea, and for a long moment, I just stared at the screen. The old version of me would have answered immediately. This version let it ring until it stopped. A few seconds later, A message appeared.
Can we talk?
I owe you an apology. I agreed to meet him in a public cafe near my apartment, neutral ground, no audience, no power imbalance. When he arrived, he looked smaller somehow, less certain. He didn't sit right away. My mom went too far, he said quickly. I see that now. I waited. And I should have said something, he added. I didn't handle it well. That's true. I replied calmly. He frowned, clearly expecting more. Tears, anger, relief. I've been thinking a lot, he continued. I didn't realize how serious it was. I didn't understand how much that exam meant to you. I set my cup down. That's the problem, Daniel. You didn't need to understand. You needed to respect it. He opened his mouth, then closed it. I just didn't want to cause a scene. I know, I said. And that choice told me everything. He finally sat down, rubbing his hands together. We could start over. I can set boundaries with my family this time. I shook my head gently. You're asking for another chance because it's uncomfortable now. Not because it was wrong then. His eyes dropped to the table. Walking away from him that night felt different than leaving his parents' house. There was no adrenaline, no anger. Just clarity. Some apologies don't come from growth. They come from loss. And I had already moved on. For a long time after everything ended, I replayed that dinner in my head. Not because of Margaret's smirk. Not even because of Daniel's silence. But because of how close I came to doubting myself. That was the most dangerous moment of all. I used to think respect came from being accepted by a partner, by their family, by people who looked confident and well-connected. I believed that if I worked hard enough, spoke carefully enough, proved myself clearly enough, they would eventually see my value. I was wrong. Real respect doesn't begin with other people. It begins the moment you stop negotiating your worth. That night taught me that silence in the face of mistreatment is not neutrality. It's permission. And choosing peace at the cost of your dignity is not compromise, it's self-betrayal. I also learned that knowledge, especially legal knowledge, isn't about power over others. It's about protection. About knowing where the lines are and refusing to let anyone cross them just because they smile while doing it. Walking away didn't make me weak. It made me free. Today, when I think about that exam, it's no longer tied to their laughter. It's tied to the moment I stood up for myself, calmly, clearly, and without apology. And that, more than any certificate or title, is the achievement I'm most proud of.